Hello, fellow Americans. This is Mr. Steffler. I'm coming to you from room 111, and I am going to read the Texas Revolution. Your names and terms: Stephen Austin, Tejano, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, Sam Houston, William Travis, Juan Sanguin, Battle of the Alamo, Lone Star Republic. Main idea: American and Tejano citizens led Texas to independence from Mexico. Why it matters now: the diverse culture of Texas has developed from the contributions of many different groups. The Texas Revolution. One American story. The son of a bankrupt Missouri mine owner, Stephen Austin, read his mother's letter written in 1821 in stunned silence. His father, Moses Austin, was dead. In the last moments, she told her son, "He called me to his bedside. He begged me to tell you to take his place, to go on in the same way he would have done." Stephen knew what he meant. Moses Austin had spent the last years of his life chasing a crazy dream. He hoped to found a new colony for Americans in Spanish Texas. Stephen's dream, though, was to be a lawyer, not a colonizer. Yet, as a loving and obedient son, he could not deny his father's dying wish. A week after his father's death, Stephen Austin was standing on Texas soil. From that day on, his father's dream was to be his destiny. This section will explain how Stephen Austin, along with others, worked hard to make the lands of Texas a good place to live. Their spirit to create an independent Texas Republic. Later, Texas would become a state of the United States. Spanish Texas. The Spanish land called Tejas bordered the United States territory called Louisiana. The land was rich and desirable. It had forests in the east, rich soil for growing corn and cotton. It had grassy plains for grazing animals. It also had rivers leading to natural ports on the Gulf of Mexico. It was the home to the Plains and Pueblo Native Americans. Even though Texas was a state in the Spanish colony of New Spain, it had few Spanish settlers. Around 1819, Spanish soldiers drove off Americans trying to claim these lands as part of the Louisiana Purchase. In 1821, only about 4,000 Tejanos lived in Texas. Tejanos are people of Spanish heritage who consider Texas their home. The Apache, Comanche, and other tribes fought fiercely against the Spanish settlements in Texas. Spanish officials wanted many more settlers to move to Texas. They hoped the new colonists would help defend against Native Americans and Americans who were illegally sneaking into Texas. To attract more people to Texas, the Spanish government offered huge tracts of land to imperiosos, but they were unable to attract Spanish settlers. So when Moses Austin asked permission to start a colony in Texas, Spain agreed. Austin was promised a large section of land. He agreed that settlers on his land had to follow Spanish laws. Mexican independence changes Texas. Shortly after Stephen Austin arrived in Texas in 1821, Mexico successfully gained its independence from Spain. Tejas was now part of Mexico. With the change in government, the Spanish land grant given to Austin's father was worthless. Stephen Austin traveled to Mexico City to persuade the new Mexican government to let him start his colony. It took almost a year to get permission, and the Mexican government would consent only if the new settlers agreed to become Mexican citizens and members of the Roman Catholic Church. Between 1821 and 1827, Austin attracted 297 families to the new settlement. These original Texas settler families are known as the Old 300. He demanded evidence that each family head was moral, worked hard, and did not drink. So law-abiding were his colonists that Austin could write to a new settler, "You would be astonished to see all of our houses with no other fastening than a wooden pin or door latch." The success of Austin's colony attracted more land speculators and settlers to Texas from the United States. Some were looking for a new life. Some were escaping the law, and others were looking for a chance to grow rich. By 1830, the population had swollen to about 30,000, with the Americans outnumbering the Tejanos 6-1. Rising tensions in Texas. As more Americans settled in Texas, tensions between the Tejanos increased. Used to governing themselves, Americans resented following Mexican laws. Since few Americans spoke Spanish, they were unhappy that all official documents had to be in that language. Slave owners were especially upset when Mexico outlawed slavery in 1829. They wanted to maintain slavery so they could grow cotton. Austin persuaded the government to allow slave owners to keep their slaves. On the other hand, Tejanos found the Americans difficult to live with, too. The Tejanos thought that the Americans believed that they were superior and deserved special privileges. The Americans seemed unwilling to adapt to Mexican laws. The Mexican government sent an official to Texas to investigate the tensions. He was not happy with what he found. In 1829, he reported to his government, "I am warning you to take timely measures. Texas could throw the whole nation into revolution." His advice turned out to be right. Responding to the warnings, the Mexican government cracked down on Texas. First, it closed the state to further American immigration. Next, it required Texans to pay taxes for the first time. Finally, to enforce these laws, the government sent Mexican troops to Texas. Texans revolt against Mexico. These actions caused angry protests. Some Texans even talked about breaking away from Mexico. Most, however, listened to Austin, who remained loyal to Mexico. In 1833, Austin set off to Mexico City with a petition. This document listed reforms supported by both Americans and Tejanos. The most important request was that Texas be a self-governing state within Mexico. In Mexico City, Austin met with General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, the Mexican president. At first, the general agreed to most of the reforms in Austin's petition. But when Santa Anna learned of a letter Austin had written, the letter said that if the changes weren't approved, Austin would support breaking away from Mexican rule. This was rebellion. The general had Austin jailed for an entire year. The Texans were furious and ready to rebel. Santa Anna's answer to talk of rebellion was to send more troops to Texas. In late 1835, Mexican soldiers marched to the town of Gonzales. They had ordered to seize a cannon used by the Texans to protect themselves against Native Americans. The Texans volunteered, hung a flag with a big gun on it, and said, "Come and take it." The Mexican troops failed to capture the cannon. 2 months later, Texans drove the Mexican troops out of an old mission in San Antonio that was used as a fortress. It was called the Alamo. Among the Texas volunteers were free African Americans such as Hendrick Arnold and Greensbury Logan. Angered by these insults, Santa Anna and 6,000 troops headed to Texas. The fight for the Alamo. On March 1st and 2nd, 1836, Texans met at a settlement called Washington on the Brazos to decide what to do about Santa Anna's troops. They believed they could only do one thing, to declare Texas a free and independent republic. Sam Houston, the only man at the meeting with military experience, was placed in command of the Texas Army. The Texas Army had hardly existed. At that moment, there was two small forces ready to stand up to Santa Anna's army. One was a company of 420 men led by James Fannin, stationed in Goliad, a fort in southeast Texas, and the second was a company of 183 volunteers at the Alamo, headed by William Travis. This small force included the famous frontiersmen Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie. In addition, Juan Sanguin led a band of 25 Tejanos in support of the revolution. On February 23, 1836, Santa Anna's troops surrounded the Alamo, and the next day Mexicans began their siege of the Alamo. 2 nights later, Travis scrawled this message to the world: "The enemy has demanded our surrender. I have answered them with a cannon shot, and our flag still waves proudly over the walls. I shall never surrender or retreat, to the people of Texas and the Americans around the world." Because Juan Sanguin spoke Spanish, he was chosen to carry the plea through enemy lines. Sanguin got the message through to other Texan defenders, but when he returned, he saw the Alamo was in flames. The Alamo defenders held off the Mexican attack for 12 violent days. Travis and his defenders stubbornly refused to surrender. On the 13th day, Santa Anna ordered more than 1,800 men to storm the fortress. The Texans met the attackers with a hailstorm of cannon and gunfire. Then suddenly it became strangely quiet. The Texans had run out of ammunition. At the end of the day, all but 5 Texans were dead. The Battle of the Alamo was over. The Battle of the Alamo was so intense that Davy Crockett did not have time to reload his gun, which he called Betsy. He used it as a club. In this print of the 20th century illustrator Frederick Jahn. Those men who had not died in the fighting were executed by Santa Anna's command. In total, 183 defenders died. A few women and children were not killed. Susanna Dickinson, one of the survivors, was ordered by Santa Anna to tell the story of the Alamo, and other Texans. He hoped the story would discourage more rebellion. The slaughter at the Alamo shocked the Texans and showed them how hard they would have to fight for their freedom from Mexico. Victory at San Jacinto. With Santa Anna on the attack, Texans, both soldiers and settlers, fled eastward. Houston sent a message to the men of Goliad ordering them to retreat. They were captured by the Mexicans, who executed more than 300. The Texans would not soon forget this massacre at Goliad. But even in retreat and defeat, Houston's army doubled. Now it was a fighting force of 800 angry men, which included Tejanos, American settlers, volunteers from the United States, and free and enslaved African Americans. In late April, Santa Anna caught up to Houston near San Jacinto River. Late in the afternoon on April 21st, 1836, the Texans advanced on the Mexican army. With the stillness of death, when close to Santa Anna's camp, they raced forward, rifles ready, screaming, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad." In just 18 minutes, the Texans killed more than half the Mexican army. Santa Anna was forced to sign a treaty giving it its freedom. The Battle of San Jacinto won Texas its independence. The Lone Star Republic. In September 1836, Texans raised a flag with a single star. They adopted the nickname the Lone Star Republic and proclaimed Texas an independent nation. The new nation set up its own army and navy. Sam Houston was elected the president of the Lone Star Republic by a landslide. Many Texans did not want Texas to remain independent for long. They considered themselves Americans and wanted to be part of the United States. In 1836, the Texas government asked Congress to annex Texas to the Union. Many Northerners objected. They argued that Texas would become a slave state, and they opposed any expansion of slavery. If Texas joined the Union, slave states would outnumber free states and have a voting advantage in Congress. Other people feared that annexing Texas would lead to war with Mexico. In response, Congress voted against annexation. Texas remained an independent republic for more than 10 years. In this section, you will learn that the question of annexing Texas would lead to war between the United States and Mexico. Thank you very much. Juan Sanguin was a Tejano hero of the Texas Revolution. It was Sanguin who dashed through the enemy lines at the Alamo with the last desperate attempt for aid. It was after the war that Sanguin, who arranged for his remains of the Alamo defenders to be buried with full military honors. Newcomers to Texas disliked all Tejanos falsely accused Sanguin of planning a rebellion. Fearing for his life, he fled to Mexico in 1842, there to seek refuge amongst my enemies. Sam Houston, raised by a widowed mother, Sam Houston grew up in Tennessee. He lived with the Cherokee for about 3 years. Later, he served in the U.S. Army and in Congress, and later as governor of Tennessee. I was a general without an army, wrote Houston, and taking command of the Texas forces in 1836. Yet, by the time it was over, he and the troops had defeated Santa Anna's larger army. Houston was elected the first president of the Republic of Texas. When Texas became a state, he served as a U.S. Senator. Thank you, and God bless America.